we think about what's come out of COP and what do we need to do post-Glasgow, I mean, how do you, in your seat, see those multiple threads coming together?
Well, I think what I would say, Michelle, is that there is a massive opportunity, whenever a government minister makes a big announcement, there is obviously inevitably a degree of cynicism or uncertainty about what progresses from that big headline announcement. So I think it's probably worth just reflecting on where we've come from and what's ahead of us. So I would characterise the government's approach as sort of three high-level sort of elements, really, in the policy making that really was set out in the Greening Finance Roadmap that we published in October. And that was about informing, acting and shifting, to giving investors the information that they need to take those climate change decisions into account in those business decisions, acting to ensure that investors have good use of that information, and then doing what we're really driving at, which is shifting financial flows to net zero as a result. Now, what the Chancellor announced at COP was actually the bold ambition on transition to make London, the city, listed companies, make us the first net zero aligned financial centre. And I think, again, there are sort of three concrete pillars that come out of that. So moving towards those mandatory transition plans, which obviously you're very involved in, and the FCA has already delivered in terms of the transition plan disclosures in the guidance that they've set out in January this year. And then through the work that we're doing together on the Transition Planning Task Force, which is actually cast the net quite wide in terms of expertise, looking to academia, looking to NGOs, looking to people across the economy to look at a sector-neutral framework. And that, again, is something that we're publishing a call for evidence on today. And then finally, setting out a transition pathway, a sectoral transition pathway. And again, that will be published as part of the Green Finance Strategy update later this year. And we're also publishing the call for evidence today. So I think I would go back to say, well, we've got a great opportunity, but it needs to be worked through carefully. And I also pick up when I am in the city and talking to people about this area, a degree of anxiety around the realism around the transition. And I guess what I would like to ask you, as this is supposed to be a two-way conversation.
No one said that.
is you're on several of these work streams. You're one of the experts in the sector in terms of making the Transition Plan Task Force Steering Group work. It'd be good to get your perspective on what you think success would look like. I mean, we in the Treasury want this to move quickly, but we also don't want it to move in a way that doesn't have credibility and wide ability to be implemented.
So 100% agree. And actually, what's interesting was we're putting the task force together, and it has cast the net really wide, is that I think the really smart thing that's happened is we've put people who are on GFANZ as part of the task force, and Amanda Blanc as co-chair. Amanda, CEO of Viva, is also, Noel mentioned today, working together in GFANZ. So there are a group of CEOs who are part of GFANZ, and that does provide the link. I think the reality is that we know it, corporates have a significant role to play in decarbonising. So if we're representing roughly 40% of global emissions, corporates like us also need to decarbonise. Corporates like LGIM, as an asset manager, also have a really huge responsibility to work with our clients to help them as they also transition. And we also have a responsibility to understand how to invest on behalf of our clients. So actually being able to measure, monitor, manage is super critical. So I know it's nuts and bolts, and actually people maybe maybe they underestimate how important disclosure is, how important having that framework is. I regard this and what's going on at the ISSB as being, really, really critical. So, and tangibly coming out of COP26, really important. So, the more work we can put in upfront now on coalescing around a framework, frameworks that are neutral for across sectors, but also giving people advice on how to disclose, that will also help make that shift that's needed to allocate capital. Because that's when we will really know we've been successful, is are we seeing capital flowing into the areas that we need to? And that for me would be the big mark of success. But you have to start with the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of how do we disclose. And Minister, look, yes, we do have corporates there, but we've also drawn in regulators. Yeah. We have NGOs who are, they really know the detail.
They won't let us get away with much.
They really won't. And the government has, I think, the government is needed to provide that framework. And you touched on it. I mean, actually, there is a roadmap that we've published, a roadmap to sustainable investing. You've been a part of driving that. I mean, how is it actually progressing from your perspective?
Well, I think it's progressing at pace. I think that we've gone, pretty quickly from what the Chancellor announced in Glasgow. I think the sustainability disclosure requirements, the mandatory implementation of that, and the consultation that BEIS and DWP have consulted on as well is important. I think we've seen a lot of momentum, as we hoped we would, around the International Sustainability Standards Board, and that's making solid progress. Again, it's this point about the sensitivity I have is we want to lead, but we want to lead in a way that creates maximum alignment. So your point about GFANZ involvement in the transition task force is also true about the standards that we hope to, the core standards that we hope to see evolve globally, because it's not in our interest to be misaligned, but it is in our interest to be leading that. And then I think the other bit that I would say is that the government's plans on consulting on the green taxonomy is also important in terms of climate change mitigation and the adaptation objectives, and we'll be doing that in the coming months as well. So that's another piece of work that we have live and working on. So there's lots of elements that we need to bring together, and I'm conscious that across different parts of financial services there are different anxieties about transition and what it looks like, and this came out in one of the earlier sessions of the task force, where I think people are anxious that in a situation where geopolitically things have changed a lot, actually how do we facilitate maximum investment in transition, but also recognise that we've got some short-term pressures that we need to come to terms with as well. And I mean, you'll be very familiar with the stewardship code as well. We've had, I think, 200 signatories to the FRC's UK stewardship code. That's really important. We're moving forward. We had another green gilt yesterday, and we've embedded that issuance now in our DMO plan for this year. So I think at all levels there's a lot of momentum.
Which is fantastic, but there needs to be momentum, doesn't there? So if you think about that, and I put an asset manager's hat on, there is also that education role that we need to play. So it's how can we all explain to people what is going on and why we're doing that. And actually, we signed up to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. I thought it was at the time. I can't tell you that we had all the answers, but actually, sometimes you have to start and know that you're going to need to figure it out as you go along. And maybe that's something that corporates are also finding, is that actually providing something that's reasonably standardized that they can use without being so prescriptive that it stops them actually thinking about their own business models. Yeah. I think it's one of the things that actually we're linking with GFANZ. We have a massive opportunity. Can I just ask you, just in terms of the risks? I mean, I think there is that risk of, maybe. Are we moving too quickly? I don't think it doesn't feel like we're moving too quickly, but are we being connected enough I mean, what are you seeing? Are you actually seeing people stepping up to the plate? What more would you like to see from all of us?
Well, I think at the moment the cost of living and the energy security issues dominate the concerns of government. And what we've got to do is navigate those real human concerns with the imperative around climate change. We've got to do that sensibly, but we can't actually separate the two, because I think transition plans can help alleviate by giving clarity around the opportunities for investment, business investment decisions, and deal with some of the pressure points. So for me, it's about rapid movement to bring as much clarity on disclosure, as much alignment as possible, and ensure that there's as little fragmentation as possible, and that we deal honestly and plainly with the concerns around the transition, and actually challenge where we sometimes have a very purist view that there is a sort of single moment of transition. That will not happen. What we have got to do, though, is be open and clear about what different companies and sectors have got to face if we're going to get to where we need to go. I think we're making a lot of progress on that, but I think the best way of doing it is to be open and clear with the public and with the industry as widely as possible, working with regulators, working with NGOs, working with those people who will be naturally skeptical so that we can get to the best point. But there are opportunities and we've got to realise them.
Do you want to talk about the consultation that's been launched today?
Well, the consultations will give us, as ever, I think I've launched about 35 consultations over the last 7 months. So I do sometimes lose where we are with all of them. But I think what they'll do is again, give us the maximum opportunity to get this right. And as you've seen with the other work we've done on, for example, the asset management task force, we've done reports, then moved forward, created new normalized behaviors, and then roll it out. So what I hope, for example, with the work that will come later on with taxonomy, we recognise there are a range of views. So I hope that with these consultations we'll get to a clearer point and be able to accelerate the journey that we're on.
And actually, I think that's one of the things that we can all help with. So as we try and move from that consulting mode to what is the actual framework, the contribution here is we need people to really help with what's going to matter to companies. I mean, one of the things that I worry about, and you're right, Minister, to point out the situation at the minute, which is extremely challenging, and it will be for a lot of households, is one of the things that I also worry about is, as an investor, there's a lot of pressure on a lot of our clients to demonstrate how they are also doing on this transition journey. And actually, my preference is that you engage with companies, you talk about what's happening, and that you work with them to make that transition. And we've heard quite a lot today about how challenging that is going to be in some sectors, and nevertheless, it needs to all work together. So I am concerned that actually divestment is the ultimate thing that one might do as an investor. We have a climate impact pledge. It's our 5th year, actually. We've been working with companies, and I can see the change. But that engagement is so important. And actually, for us, as we think about countries as well as companies, sort of how do we all help, particularly as we transition to COP27, is how do we make sure that all of the good work can then translate into what are we doing in the real economy everywhere. And actually, some of these plans can be super helpful, but we need to find something that we can also all work with and within.
Well, I think one of the concerns we have and that we've got to deal with is that risk of misalignment between the wider real economy, if you like, and the financial services sector. And that's why on the task force, as you know, we've had representatives from Austin and Unilever on that steering group who are experts that will lead us into that real economy transition. and we've got to think of it holistically. I've always said in the 4.5 years I've been doing this job that financial services, the efficient allocation of capital is the underpinning of the wider economy. But we can't have wide discrepancies in understanding or expectations of disclosure that would, create ambiguity, uncertainty, and that point that I started with, which is the sort of cynicism over how real the transition is and how serious we are as a government and as an economy about making the transition effectively.
Yeah, and also recognise, as you say, that the real economy is what will drive success. And actually, if we all can't help with that, then we are going to be faced with an even greater challenge than we have today. I mean, I think if you look at how much capital has to be allocated, and we estimate that roughly 30 trillion, give or take, into new energy that's going to help drive global economies, that can only happen if people like asset managers, like banks. Noel was talking earlier on about how HSBC is approaching that. He's looking at individual transition plans to try and understand what needs to be done. So getting under the skin of that is really important. We have to have a demonstrable way of assessing that and have the appetite to take the risk. But these kinds of disclosures, and what I think is happening with GFANZ and also Transition Plan Task Force, it's starting somewhere with that in the detail to actually be able to demonstrate in a really clear and consistent way to the market, so we get proper market signals on pricing, so that we can determine between those companies that are doing some really great things but are just not quite where they need to be yet, to the companies who are not. And that is going to take a wee while.
I couldn't agree more, and I think what you've done there is set out the challenge that we face this year. What we've got to continue to do is work quickly. There's a good iterative loop, I think, between industry and government on these matters. And I think I take the challenge to respond to those calls for evidence today as quickly as we can, and have a whole economy, whole government response that does justice to the challenge we face, but also, as I said earlier, the opportunity that definitely exists at this particularly difficult time.
Yes, and I think I'll wrap it there by saying it's a huge challenge, but also a massive opportunity. And we need to be able to see both sides and bring it together.